May 1st, 1942, 9:30 a.m. sharp. Inside the steel belly of battleship Yamato, Rear Admiral Matone Ugaki observed young officers positioning wooden pieces across an enormous war table that mapped the entire Pacific Theater. 20 high-ranking admirals in ceremonial dress entered the chamber, each accompanied by aides clutching folders stuffed with operational documents. Their mission: conduct war simulations to validate the strategy that would secure Japan's dominance in the Pacific. The objective was Midway Atoll, a speck of coral sitting 1,400 miles northwest of the Hawaiian Islands. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had crafted what he believed was a flawless plan: draw American aircraft carriers into an ambush, annihilate them in one climactic engagement, and compel Washington to accept a negotiated peace. The strategy was intricate, sophisticated, and required synchronizing hundreds of vessels across vast oceanic distances. These simulations would identify any weaknesses before actual combat commenced. Except the entire exercise was manipulated from its inception. Ugaki served dual roles as head referee, the individual who would interpret dice results and declare outcomes, and simultaneously as Yamamoto's right-hand man, the architect behind much of what they were testing. He possessed every motivation to demonstrate the operation's guaranteed success, and when random chance predicted catastrophe, he simply rewrote reality. Japan in May 1942 existed in a state of euphoric triumph. Within half a year, the Imperial Navy had seized an empire spanning from the Aleutian Chain to the Indonesian archipelago. The victories appeared unstoppable. December 7, 1941 saw 6 Japanese carriers assault Pearl Harbor, destroying or crippling 8 American battleships and claiming over 2,400 lives. 10 hours later, Japanese warplanes obliterated most American air power in the Philippines while still grounded. Within 48 hours, Japanese aircraft sent the British warships Prince of Wales and Repulse to the bottom of Malaya's coast, demonstrating that even mighty battleships were defenseless against aerial assault. The conquests rolled forward. Through winter months, Hong Kong capitulated on Christmas. Manila fell January 2nd. The fortress of Singapore, deemed impenetrable, surrendered February 15th, with 85,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers captured. The Dutch East Indies crumbled in March, granting Japan the petroleum resources it desperately required. Burma collapsed in May, severing China's supply corridor and menacing India. The carriers Akogi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had ranged across the Pacific without sustaining a single significant loss. They had hammered Pearl Harbor, supported invasions throughout Southeast Asia, raided into the Indian Ocean, and sunk the British carrier Hermes near Ceylon. Japanese aviators flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, the world's premier carrier-based fighter. During the war's first 6 months, Zeros had outclassed every opponent encountered. Allied airmen reported the Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outrange anything Britain or America fielded. Japanese strategists believed themselves invincible. Every operation had succeeded. Every engagement had been won. American and British forces seemed powerless to halt Japanese advances anywhere. Military commanders in Tokyo spoke with absolute confidence about dictating peace terms within months. The notion that Japan might actually suffer a major defeat seemed absurd. They called it victory disease, the presumption that success breeds inevitable success. The refusal to acknowledge enemies might adapt, improve, or catch a fortunate break. The arrogance that emerges from winning so consistently that you stop genuinely considering defeat. Victory disease contaminated Japanese planning at every echelon, from junior officers through admirals to the government's highest levels. That disease infected the war simulations from their opening moments. The exercises unfolded over for days in early May aboard Yamato, anchored at Hashirajima in Japan's inland sea. The vessel was history's largest battleship. 72,000 tons of armor and weaponry, mounting 9 18-inch guns capable of hurling 1-ton shells across 25 miles. She symbolized Japanese naval supremacy, and selecting her as the simulation venue transmitted a message about this operation's significance. The mess hall had been emptied and transformed into a scale Pacific Ocean model. The table stretched nearly 40 feet across, covered with gridded charts displaying Midway, Hawaii, and the immense ocean separating them. Wooden blocks symbolized ships, each labeled with vessel names and classifications. Colored markers indicated positions and movements. Dice introduced the randomness element that made warfare unpredictable. Multiple referees surrounded the table, each managing different simulation aspects. They would cast dice, reference damage charts, compute fuel consumption, and determine engagement results. The simulation was designed to be thorough. It would replicate not merely the carrier engagement, but the complete operation, the diversionary assault on the Aleutians. The invasion forces advanced toward Midway, submarine positioning to intercept American reinforcements. Battleship bombardment of Midway, troop landings, establishing airbases on the captured atoll. Every operational phase would be tested on the game board before a single vessel departed port. Theoretically, the objective was fighting the battle. Theoretically first, identifying problems and correcting them before real vessels and real sailors faced actual combat. Honest simulation could expose timing failures, reveal logistical challenges, identify tactical weaknesses. Quality wargaming could preserve lives by preventing flawed plans from execution. Practically, the exercises became ceremonial, a scripted performance designed to validate a plan senior officers had already endorsed. Nobody wanted to discover problems. Everyone wanted confirmation the operation would succeed precisely as designed. The simulations had become ritual, not evaluation. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier striking force, the four flat-tops that would attack Midway and engage American forces. Nagumo had led Pearl Harbor's assault. He was seasoned, capable, and acutely aware that combined fleet headquarters distrusted him. Yamamoto's staff had criticized Nagumo for not launching Pearl Harbor's third wave, for not pursuing and destroying American carriers that evaded the attack. Nagumo understood he walked on fragile ground, so when simulations commenced, he remained silent, posed no challenging questions, and voiced no objections. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo commanded the invasion force, the transports, and support vessels that would deploy troops on Midway after carriers neutralized American defenses. Kondo was more outspoken. He examined the plan and immediately recognized problems. How would they resupply Midway after capturing it? The atoll sat 1,400 miles from the nearest Japanese installation. Supplying a garrison that distant would demand constant convoys vulnerable to submarine predation. If they couldn't maintain Midway's supply line, they'd have to evacuate, rendering the entire operation meaningless. Yamamoto's staff acknowledged resupply might prove difficult, perhaps impossible, but the plan was already approved. Kondo's concerns were documented and dismissed. Day 1 of simulation proceeded seamlessly. Japanese forces advanced per schedule. American forces reacted exactly as anticipated. Referees cast dice to determine combat outcomes and consistently ruled favoring Japanese forces. When dice suggested Japanese casualties, Ugaki intervened to minimize damage or eliminate it entirely. The critical juncture arrived on day 2. The scenario had advanced to where Nagumo's carriers were striking Midway Island. Japanese aircraft bombed the airfield while carriers prepared follow-up strikes. Then the American player, a junior officer whose identity went unrecorded, executed an aggressive maneuver. He dispatched land-based bombers from Midway to attack Japanese carriers, while their own aircraft were absent in actual combat. This represented precisely the opportunistic strike that could devastate a carrier force. Carriers are maximally vulnerable when their aircraft are airborne. When flight decks are congested with armed and fueled planes preparing to launch or recover, a well-timed bombing assault on a carrier deck covered in aviation fuel and ordnance could trigger catastrophic chain reactions. The referee for this simulation phase was Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, a carrier division staff officer. Following protocols, Okumiya rolled dice to determine American bomber hits on Japanese carriers. The dice showed 9. According to damage tables, 9 hits meant to carriers sunk. Akagi and Kaga, the strike force's largest carriers, were ruled destroyed. Ugaki observed this outcome with obvious displeasure. To carriers sunk by land-based bombers, impossible. He didn't believe Americans would be that aggressive. Even if they were, Japanese carriers could defend themselves. Zeros would intercept the bombers. Anti-aircraft fire would eliminate survivors. Perhaps a few bombs might penetrate, but insufficient to sink to carriers. Ugaki overruled the dice. He reduced hits from 9 to 3. Kaga was still sunk, but Akagi was merely damaged. Still operational, the simulation continued. Okumiya was surprised, but remained silent. He was a lieutenant commander. Ugaki was a rear admiral and Yamamoto's closest advisor. Objecting would accomplish nothing and might damage Okumiya's career. Other officers in the chamber witnessed this intervention and understood the message. The simulations weren't designed to expose problems. They were designed to confirm success. But even the reduced damage proved too much for Ugaki to accept. Later, in the exercises, when the scenario advanced to subsequent operations, the invasion of New Caledonia and Fiji, Kaga mysteriously reappeared. The carrier rule sunk hours earlier in simulation. Time was back on the board, ready to participate in the next operation. No explanation was offered. The referee had simply decided that sinking Kaga was inconvenient to the overall plan. So Kaga would not remain sunk. This wasn't the only manipulation. Throughout the 4-day exercise, whenever dice rolls suggested Japanese setbacks or casualties, Ugaki intervened. Air combat outcomes were adjusted favoring Japan. American forces behaved in ways making them easy to defeat. Scenarios that might expose plan weaknesses were ruled unrealistic and rerun until producing acceptable outcomes. The most revealing manipulation involved American carrier movements. In the actual plan, Yamamoto expected American carriers to sortie from Pearl Harbor after Midway's attack commenced, racing to defend the atoll and walking into the trap Japanese forces had prepared. But in the simulations, the American player attempted a different strategy. He sorted carriers early, positioning them near Midway before the Japanese attack began, allowing them to strike first. This was exactly what would happen in the real battle 1 month later. But in the simulation, Ugaki ruled this scenario impossible. The Americans couldn't possibly know the attack was coming. They couldn't position carriers in advance. The American player was forced to keep carriers at Pearl Harbor until after the Japanese struck Midway, exactly as Yamamoto's plan assumed. One officer spoke up. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant carrier tacticians, was troubled by the assumption Americans wouldn't sortie early. Genda had planned Pearl Harbor's attack. He understood Americans were capable of surprise and aggression. He warned that if American carriers were already near Midway when the attack began, the entire operation could be jeopardized. Genda's concerns were acknowledged and dismissed. The plan assumed Americans would react, not anticipate. Changing that assumption would require redesigning the entire operation. Nobody wanted that. The simulations had already validated the plan. Questions were unwelcome. By the 4 days' conclusion, the simulations had confirmed exactly what senior officers desired confirmed. The Midway operation would succeed. American carriers would be destroyed. Japan would win a decisive victory, forcing the United States to negotiate peace. Officers departed Yamato confident the plan was sound. The problem was that confidence was constructed on deception. The first deception was that Japanese intelligence was reliable. In reality, American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code designated JN-5 since early 1942. Commander Joseph Rockford and his team at Station HYPO in Hawaii had been deciphering fragments of Japanese radio communications. By April, they knew Japan was planning a major operation against a target code named AF. Rockford believed AF was Midway, but Washington disagreed. To prove his case, Rockford devised a clever trick. He had Midway's base send an unencrypted radio message reporting their water distillation plant had malfunctioned, and the island was experiencing freshwater shortage. It was complete fabrication, but Japanese intelligence intercepted the message and believed it. 2 days later, May 22nd, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese intelligence report stating AF was short of water. Rockford had his proof. AF was Midway. The Americans knew where the attack would come and approximately when. Japan had no idea Americans were reading their communications. The simulations on Yamato proceeded on the assumption that strategic surprise was guaranteed. But surprise was already lost. The fundamental premise of Yamamoto's plan was compromised before the first ship departed port. The second deception concerned American carrier strength. At the Battle of Coral Sea in early May, Japanese and American carrier forces had fought history's first naval battle, where opposing ships never sighted each other. All combat was conducted by aircraft. The battle was part of Japan's operation to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea, which would threaten Australia and extend Japanese control over the South Pacific. The battle lasted 2 days. May 7th, American aircraft sank the light carrier Shoho. May 8th, both sides launched major strikes. Japanese aircraft damaged carrier Yorktown and delivered devastating attacks on Lexington. Multiple torpedo and bomb hits set Lexington ablaze. Despite heroic damage control efforts, fires reached aviation fuel storage, triggering massive explosions. The crew abandoned ship and Lexington was scuttled by American destroyers. Japan lost the light carrier Shoho and suffered damage to fleet carrier Shokaku severe, enough to remove her from action for months. Another fleet carrier, Zuikaku, lost. So many aircraft and pilots that she couldn't participate in the Midway operation. Even though the ship itself was undamaged, Japanese intelligence assessed Yorktown as sunk alongside Lexington. Pilots reported seeing both American carriers burning and dead in the water. The assessment seemed reasonable, but reality was different. Yorktown had taken a single bomb hit that penetrated deep into the ship before exploding, but skilled damage control had contained the damage. The ship limped away from battle, trailing oil, but still under power. Japanese intelligence concluded only two American carriers remained operational: Enterprise and Hornet. The Midway plan was constructed around facing two carriers, a force Japanese planners believed their four carriers could easily defeat. The mathematics seemed simple. 4 carriers against 2 experienced Japanese pilots against inexperienced Americans. Superior Japanese aircraft against inferior American planes. Victory seemed certain. In reality, Yorktown had not sunk. The ship limped back to Pearl Harbor with a massive hole in the flight deck and structural damage. That would normally require 3 months in a shipyard to repair. A 551-pound bomb had penetrated through 6 decks before exploding above the forward engine room. The explosion destroyed 6 watertight compartments, killed 66 men, wrecked elevator machinery, disabled radar and refrigeration systems, and opened seams along 30 hull frames. Fuel oil leaked into the ocean, leaving a slick stretching for miles behind the ship. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who inspected the damage during the voyage back to Hawaii, estimated repairs would take 90 days under normal circumstances. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, didn't have 90 days. Station HYPO had broken the Japanese codes. Rochefort's team knew the Japanese were planning a major operation. They knew the target was Midway. They knew the approximate attack date. Nimitz needed every carrier he could deploy. He couldn't afford leaving Yorktown in dry dock while the battle was fought. He ordered Pearl Harbor's repair crews to accomplish the impossible. When Yorktown arrived May 27th, 1 day ahead of schedule, Nimitz cut orders voiding safety regulations. Normally, the ship would spend a full day purging aviation fuel from storage tanks. Before entering dry dock, Nimitz ordered the ship into dry dock number 1 immediately with fuel still aboard. More than 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed over Yorktown. They worked continuously for 72 hours straight, welding steel plates, patching holes, restoring systems, rolling blackouts. Across Oahu provided electricity for the massive welding effort. May 30th, 3 days after entering port, Yorktown put to sea with some repair crews still aboard finishing work as the ship headed for battle. The ship wasn't fully repaired, but it was operational. Japan would face 3 carriers, not 2. The third deception was about timing. Yamamoto's plan assumed American carriers wouldn't sortie until after Midway's attack began. The carriers were supposedly at Pearl Harbor, nearly 1,400 miles away. Even if they raced to Midway at maximum speed the moment the attack started, they couldn't arrive until battle's 2nd or 3rd day. By then, Japanese forces would have captured the island and would be waiting in prepared positions. But Nimitz knew when the attack was coming. He sent Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown to sea days before the Japanese fleet arrived, positioning them northeast of Midway at a predetermined rendezvous point called Point Luck. On the morning of June 4th, when Nagumo's carriers launched their attack on Midway, American carriers were already positioned 100 miles away. Waiting to strike, the real battle commenced exactly 1 month after the simulations ended. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Nagumo launched the first strike against Midway. 36 dive bombers, 36 torpedo bombers, and 36 Zero fighters headed for the island, while carriers prepared a second wave armed with torpedoes to attack American ships if they appeared. Simultaneously, Nagumo launched 7 reconnaissance aircraft to search for American forces. But the search was poorly organized, too few aircraft covering too much ocean, flying in adverse weather, taking off late due to mechanical problems. One scout from Cruiser Tone was delayed 30 minutes, a delay that would prove catastrophic. The attack on Midway caused damage, but failed to neutralize the island's defenses. The strike leader radioed back that a second attack was necessary. Nagumo made the decision that would doom his fleet. He ordered the second wave of aircraft, which were armed with torpedoes for attacking ships, to be rearmed with bombs for attacking land targets. Deck crews went to work removing torpedoes, bringing planes down to the hangar deck, swapping weapons, bringing planes back up. It was organized chaos, and it left the carriers vulnerable. At 7:28 a.m., one of Nagumo's scouts finally reported sighting American ships. The message was vague, giving no indication whether carriers were present. Nagumo hesitated. Should he continue rearming for a second strike on Midway, or should he prepare to attack American ships? He ordered the rearming to stop, then changed his mind again when a follow-up message confirmed American carriers were present. Now he needed to rearm again, putting torpedoes back on aircraft that had just had bombs loaded. More time lost, more confusion. By mid-morning, Nagumo's flight decks were covered with armed and fueled aircraft, ammunition, and ordnance. Exactly the scenario the simulations should have identified as dangerous. Exactly the situation Okumiya's dice roll had predicted. But because Ugaki had dismissed that scenario as unrealistic, no precautions had been taken. American attacks began at 9:30 a.m. Torpedo bombers from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown pressed home their attacks with suicidal courage. The obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator was slow and poorly armed. The aircraft had a maximum speed of just 115 miles per hour when carrying a torpedo, making it an easy target for the faster, more maneuverable Zeros. Japanese fighters slaughtered them. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet attacked first. 15 Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron flew directly toward the Japanese carriers without fighter escort. Waldron had told his pilots before taking off that if only one aircraft survived to launch its torpedo, the mission would be a success. His prediction was horrifyingly accurate. Zeros swarmed the slow-moving torpedo bombers. One by one, the Devastators were shot down. Some crashed in flames, others broke apart in midair. A few managed to release their torpedoes before being hit, but the weapons ran too slow, and the Japanese carriers easily avoided them. All 15 aircraft were destroyed. Only Ensign George K. survived, floating in the ocean for 30 hours, watching the battle rage around him, hiding under his seat cushion. When Japanese ships passed close by, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. 14 Devastators approached from a different angle. The result was the same. Zeros pounced on them. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. 10 of the 14 aircraft were shot down. Not one torpedo hit. Then came Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, the only squadron that had fighter escort. even with Wildcat fighters trying to protect them. 12 of 13 Devastators were destroyed. The carnage was almost complete. Of 41 Devastators that attacked, only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo hit. The sacrifice seemed meaningless. The pilots and gunners who flew those missions knew they were likely flying to their deaths, but they pressed their attacks anyway. Some were so low their propellers kicked up spray from the ocean. Some were so close to the Japanese carriers that they could see sailors on deck. Running to battle stations, the torpedoes they carried were obsolete Mark 13 models that ran too slow, ran too deep, and often failed to explode even when they hit. But the crews attacked anyway, knowing their chances of survival were almost zero, hoping their sacrifice would create an opening for someone else. The torpedo attacks drew Japanese fighters down to low altitude and scattered the combat air patrol across miles of ocean. The carriers were exposed and high above, invisible to Japanese lookouts focused on the torpedo bombers below. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were beginning their attack runs. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey from Enterprise had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, burning fuel his squadron couldn't spare. At 10 a.m., running low on fuel and considering turning back, McCluskey made a critical decision. He spotted the Japanese destroyer Orochi racing northeast to rejoin the fleet after hunting for the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake at 10:22 a.m. McCluskey led 37 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise into a nearly vertical dive toward Akagi and Kaga. 2 minutes later, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 more Dauntlesses from Yorktown toward Soryu. The Japanese carriers had no warning. Their fighters were at sea level chasing torpedo bombers. Their anti-aircraft gunners were focused downward. Nobody saw the dive bombers until bombs were already falling. The attack took 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, the course of the Pacific War reversed. Kaga took for bomb hits. The first penetrated the flight deck near the forward elevator. The next 3 straddled the midship elevator. All 4 bombs detonated among aircraft being rearmed on the hangar deck. Aviation fuel ignited. Torpedoes exploded. Ammunition cooked off. Within minutes, the interior of the carrier was an inferno. Firefighting efforts failed. 800 men died. The crew abandoned ship. Kaga sank that evening. Akagi took only 1 bomb hit, striking the flight deck near the midship elevator. But the damage was catastrophic. The bomb detonated among armed aircraft waiting to launch. Fuel and ordnance exploded in a chain reaction that gutted the ship. Fires spread faster than damage control teams could fight them. The bridge filled with smoke. Nagumo was forced to transfer his flag to light cruiser Nagara. Akagi burned through the night and was scuttled the next morning by Japanese destroyers. Soryu took 3 hits in as many minutes. The first blasted the flight deck forward of the elevator. The next struck near the midship elevator. Like Kaga and Akagi, Soryu's hangar deck was packed with armed aircraft and ordnance. The bombs triggered explosions that tore the ship apart. Soryu sank that evening, taking 700 men with her. 3 carriers destroyed in 5 minutes. Exactly what the dice had predicted in the simulations. Exactly what Ugaki had ruled impossible. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, was operating separately and escaped the initial attack. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, Hiryu's commander, immediately launched a counterattack against the American carriers. His aircraft found Yorktown and put 3 bombs into her at noon. Damage control crews worked miracles. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was steaming at 19 knots and recovering aircraft. Japanese pilots returning from a second strike thought they were attacking a different undamaged carrier. They put 2 torpedoes into Yorktown's port side at 4:20 p.m. This time, the damage was too severe. The ship lost all power and developed a 23-degree list. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship. Later that afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu and hit her with 4 bombs. Like the other carriers, Hiryu was doomed by fires and induced explosions. She sank the next morning. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship. By the end of June 4th, Japan had lost all 4 carriers that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Approximately 3,000 Japanese sailors and pilots were dead, including many of the most experienced and highly trained aviators in the fleet. The carriers could eventually be replaced. The pilots could not. It took years to train a carrier pilot to the skill level Japan had lost in a single day. The United States lost Yorktown, finally sunk by Japanese submarine I-168 on June 7th, and destroyer Hammond. Total American casualties were 307 men, a devastating exchange ratio. Japan had gambled everything on a decisive battle and lost catastrophically. The battle turned on timing measured in minutes and decisions made in seconds. If Tone's scout plane had launched on time instead of 30 minutes late, Nagumo would have known about American carriers earlier and might have prepared differently. If American dive bombers had arrived 10 minutes earlier or 10 minutes later, Japanese fighters would have been in position to intercept them. If Nagumo had not changed his mind about rearming his aircraft, his flight decks would not have been covered with explosives when the bombs fell. But the deeper cause of the disaster was the overconfidence built during those 4 days of simulations on Yamato, because Ugaki had overruled the dice. Japanese planners never seriously considered what would happen if carriers were attacked while rearming aircraft. Because the simulations assumed Americans would not sortie early, no provisions were made for detecting American carriers before they struck. Because uncomfortable scenarios were dismissed as unrealistic, the Japanese fleet sailed into battle unprepared for exactly the situation they encountered. The man who played the American side in the simulations, the unnamed junior officer who sent land-based bombers against Japanese carriers while they were vulnerable, had predicted the battle more accurately than Japan's senior admirals. But nobody listened to him, because the scenario was ruled impossible by a referee, who refused to accept that Japan might lose. Japan tried to conceal the disaster's scale. Radio Tokyo announced a great victory at Midway. The Japanese public was told American forces had been driven back with heavy losses. No mention was made of the 4 carriers. Casualty lists were not published for months. Japanese newspapers reported that Akogi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were still operating with the fleet. Wounded survivors were quarantined in hospitals and forbidden to speak about what happened. Junior officers who had witnessed the battle were transferred to remote posts. With orders never to discuss Midway, the ships were kept on the active roster, listed as deployed but unavailable. When families inquired about crew members who had died, they were told only that their loved ones had fallen in action. No details were provided about where or how. The deception was so complete that many Japanese citizens did not learn the truth until after the war ended. Even within the military, only senior officers knew the full extent of the defeat. Replacement pilots training for carrier operations. were told their predecessors had been reassigned, not killed. Strategic planning continued as though first-line carriers were available for deployment. The cover-up served a short-term political purpose, preventing damage to morale and preserving confidence in military leadership. But it also prevented learning from failure. If junior officers didn't know what happened at Midway, they couldn't develop tactics to prevent it from happening again. If planners didn't acknowledge the defeat, they couldn't analyze what went wrong. The same overconfidence that infected the simulations continued to infect Japanese strategy. Through the remainder of the war, the strategic consequences were immediate and catastrophic for Japan. Japan's entire war strategy had always depended on winning quickly before American industrial might could fully mobilize. The plan was to seize a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, fortify it, and make any American counteroffensive so costly that Washington would negotiate a peace settlement that left Japan in control of its conquests. Midway was supposed to be the decisive battle that would destroy American carrier power and force that negotiation when the knockout blow failed. When the four carriers sank instead of achieving victory, Japan's strategic position became hopeless. The defensive perimeter was incomplete. American carriers remained a threat. And now Japan had lost for fleet carriers over 300 aircraft and nearly 3,000 trained personnel, including irreplaceable veteran pilots. The losses could not be made good in time to matter. American forces began offensive operations at Guadalcanal in August 1942. Barely 2 months after Midway, the landing caught Japan by surprise. For 6 months, both sides poured resources into the struggle for the island and surrounding waters. Japan fought desperately to hold Guadalcanal, but without carrier superiority, every battle became harder. The naval battles around Guadalcanal throughout late 1942 and early 1943 cost Japan 2 more carriers, Ryuyo and Hio, along with hundreds more irreplaceable pilots. Cruisers and destroyers fought savage night battles in Iron Bottom Sound, where so many ships were sunk that the seafloor was carpeted with wreckage. Meanwhile, American shipyards were launching new carriers at an astonishing rate that Japanese planners had not believed possible. The Essex-class fleet carriers were massive ships, displacing 36,000 tons, capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft, and built to take punishment. The first Essex-class carrier joined the fleet in December 1942. Less than 6 months after Midway. More followed at intervals of just a few months. By mid-1944, the United States had more fleet carriers in the Pacific than Japan had possessed. At the war's start, escort carriers built on merchant ship hulls using mass production techniques came off production lines even faster. These smaller carriers couldn't match fleet carriers in aircraft capacity or speed, but they could provide air cover for convoys, support amphibious landings, and hunt submarines. American shipyards launched escort carriers at a rate of 1 every few weeks. By 1944, the United States Navy had more than 100 escort carriers in service. The industrial capacity that had seemed irrelevant in May 1942 became decisive by 1944. American factories produced aircraft by the tens of thousands. In 1940, for alone, American industry built nearly 100,000 aircraft of all types. Training programs graduated new pilots by the hundreds every month. The United States had enough productive capacity that damaged ships were repaired in weeks. Instead of months, lost aircraft were replaced faster than they could be shot down. and pilot losses could be made good from a seemingly inexhaustible pool of trained aviators. Japan couldn't match this production. The industrial base was smaller. Resources were scarcer. Shipyards struggled to complete new carriers against competing demands for steel, labor, and resources. Aircraft factories operated under constant threat of air attack. As American bombers reached deeper into Japanese territory, the pilot training program, already strained by combat losses, couldn't replace losses fast enough while maintaining quality standards. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carrier air groups were staffed with inexperienced pilots who stood no chance against veteran American aviators. The result was a massacre the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Ugaki survived Midway, though his reputation suffered quietly within circles that knew the truth. He continued serving as Yamamoto's chief of staff through 1943. In April 1943, American P-38 fighters, guided by decoded Japanese radio traffic, intercepted and shot down Yamamoto's aircraft over Bougainville. Ugaki was on the same flight but survived the crash with severe injuries. After months of recovery, Ugaki commanded battleship divisions and shore bases. He kept a detailed diary throughout the war. The diary reveals a man conflicted between loyalty to the plan he helped create and growing awareness that the war was lost. He acknowledged mistakes, but never fully accepted responsibility for the simulations. That validated a flawed strategy. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. Emperor Hirohito announced the decision in a radio broadcast heard across the nation. The next day, Ugaki led a final unauthorized kamikaze mission, flying a bomber toward American ships off Okinawa. He died in the attack, one of the last casualties of the war he helped prolong through overconfidence and wishful thinking. The story of the rigged simulations remained hidden for years. Japanese military records were destroyed or classified. Officers who participated either died in combat or stayed silent. The first public account came from Captain Mitsuo Fukuda and Commander Masatake Kumiya in their book published in 1955, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan. Fukuda had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and was aboard a Kogi during Midway. Okumiya was the referee whose dice roll Ugaki had overruled. Their book described the simulations in detail, including Ugaki's intervention when the dice predicted disaster. The account shocked readers in both Japan and America. Here was evidence that Japan's military leadership had known the plan was flawed, but proceeded anyway. Some historians later questioned specific details, noting that Fukuda occasionally exaggerated events, but the core facts remained undisputed. Ugaki did intervene to reduce predicted Japanese losses. The simulations did validate a flawed plan. Japan did sail into disaster despite warnings that went unheeded. Modern wargaming doctrine treats the Midway simulations as a cautionary example. Professional military education uses the story to illustrate confirmation bias, the tendency to seek information that validates existing beliefs and ignore information that challenges them. War games are supposed to expose problems, not hide them. Referees must enforce rules impartially, not adjust results to produce desired outcomes. The United States learned opposite lessons from the same battle. American war games before Midway had been rigorous and honest, exposing multiple ways operations could fail. When Nimitz planned the defense of Midway, he knew from gaming exercises that carrier battles could turn on tiny margins of timing and position. He positioned his forces to maximize surprise while minimizing exposure. Rochefort's code-breaking gave Americans information advantage. But information alone doesn't win battles. Americans still had to make correct decisions based on that information. They had to position carriers precisely, time attacks perfectly, and execute tactics flawlessly. The 5 minutes that destroyed 3 Japanese carriers required months of preparation, training, intelligence gathering, and realistic assessment of capabilities. Japan had advantages: a larger fleet, more experienced pilots, and superior aircraft. But Japan also had overconfidence, rigid planning, and leadership unwilling to question assumptions. When the dice predicted disaster during the simulations, Ugaki changed the dice instead of changing the plan. When reality proved the dice were right, it was too late. The lesson extends beyond military strategy and speaks to fundamental problems in organizational decision-making. Any organization facing complex challenges must honestly assess risks and welcome bad news. The moment an organization starts believing its own propaganda, starts dismissing uncomfortable data because it contradicts desired outcomes, starts punishing messengers who deliver warnings, that organization is heading for disaster. Leaders who punish messengers for delivering uncomfortable truths guarantee those truths will be hidden until disaster strikes. In the Japanese military hierarchy of 1942, junior officers knew that questioning senior officers could end careers. Okumiya watched Ugaki overrule the dice and said nothing, because speaking up would have accomplished nothing except damaging his own prospects. How many other officers noticed problems but stayed silent for the same reason? How many valid concerns were never raised because the culture discouraged dissent? Tests and simulations that always validate existing plans are worthless. The entire point of testing is to find failure modes before they matter. A test that cannot fail is not a test at all. It is theater. The Midway simulations were theater, a performance designed to create the appearance of rigorous planning, while actually just confirming what senior officers had already decided. The dice were props. The game table was a stage. And when the props produced the wrong result, they were simply adjusted until they produced the right one. Modern organizations repeat these mistakes constantly. Corporations run marketing tests designed to confirm that new products will succeed. Government agencies conduct studies designed to justify decisions already made. Military commands run exercises designed to validate existing doctrine. In each case, the simulation becomes theater, not honest assessment. And when reality intervenes, when the product fails, or the policy backfires, or the doctrine proves wrong, everyone acts surprised. The warning signs are always the same. When challenging questions are discouraged, when devil's advocates are seen as disloyal, when best-case scenarios are treated as most likely outcomes, when pessimistic forecasts are dismissed as negativity, when tests are designed to pass rather than to reveal problems. These are symptoms of the same disease that infected Japanese planning in 1942. If Ugaki had accepted the dice roll, if he had allowed carriers to remain sunk in the simulation, Japanese planners might have recognized the vulnerability of carriers rearming aircraft under combat conditions. They might have developed procedures for rapid launch that kept flight decks clear. They might have positioned carriers with more separation so one attack couldn't hit multiple ships. They might have improved reconnaissance to detect American carriers earlier. They might have questioned whether the entire operation was worth the risk given the possibility of heavy losses. None of those improvements were made because the simulation hid the problem. The plan sailed forward with a fatal flaw that everyone should have seen. But nobody acknowledged because acknowledging it would have required admitting the plan was flawed, which would have required changing the plan, which would have required senior officers to admit they had been wrong. Pride, institutional inertia, and fear of losing face combined to send the Japanese fleet into disaster. Instead, Japan sailed to Midway, confident the plan would succeed because a rigged simulation said it would. The dice had predicted the truth. The admirals rejected the truth, and in 5 minutes on June 4th, reality proved the dice were right. For carriers burned. 3,000 men died. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific was shattered. All because a referee looked at an uncomfortable result and decided to change it, rather than accept it. Today, the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rest in more than 17,000 feet of water northwest of Midway. Deep sea surveys have photographed the carriers where they fell. Akagi lies upright with her bow broken off. Kaga rests inverted, her hull shattered by the explosions that destroyed her. Soryu and Hiryu are scattered across miles of ocean floor. They remain war graves, protected by international agreement, visited only by remotely operated vehicles that document their condition. For historical research, the battles fought in those 5 minutes are studied in every naval academy in the world. The decisions made by Nagumo, Spruance, and Fletcher are dissected in command courses. The intelligence work by Rockfoot is taught as the gold standard of signals analysis. The sacrifices of the torpedo bomber crews are honored as examples of courage under impossible odds. But the story of the simulations teaches a different lesson. It shows what happens when leaders value certainty over truth, when uncomfortable predictions are dismissed rather than addressed, when tests are designed to confirm rather than challenge. Ugaki rolled the dice, saw disaster, and decided disaster was impossible. Reality disagreed. The dice were right. The admiral was wrong. And for carriers burned because confidence mattered more than truth.